Welcome to this video, the introduction to exam topic 5, using loop constructs. My name's Andy Wicks, and in this video we're going to look at the following exam objectives. We're going to look at how you create and use while loops. We're going to look at how to create and use for loops, including the enhanced for loop. We're going to look at how to create and use do while loops. And we're going to compare loop constructs. Finally, we're going to look at the break and continue commands. Let's go into the first topic, creating and using while loops. The general format for a while loop is while, and then in brackets some condition is true, and then in the curly brackets those are the tasks that get done. You'll have seen this many times. So a specific example might be, while x greater than 3, system out println x, x++. And that will print out the value of x, incrementing x by 1 each time it goes round. But what happens if x starts out as bigger than 3, supposing it started out as 4? Note that the commands within the while loop will not be executed if the condition returns false. So if we started with x equals 4, it would never see that systemout.println. You can use any logical expression for a condition, so you can use things like x greater than 12, or you can use a Boolean variable. So, for example, whilst not OK. How about a question? I'll give you a moment to work out what will be output by the following code. Okay, let's go. We'll go through each line of code one at a time. First of all, we create a string variable called txt and populate it with the word Fred. Now we've got an outer while loop and an inner while loop. We only go to the inner while loop if the expression in the first while loop evaluates to true. Txt length greater than 2. Well, since Fred is 4 characters long, the length of txt is greater than 2. So now we come to the inner while loop. The inner while loop says, while length txt less than 7, add an a. So it'll add an a to Fred and make Fred a. Now it'll go round that loop again. Txt's length is 5. So it'll add another A. So now we've got Fred AA. Then it'll go round the loop again because the length is only 6. And it'll add an A again. So txt plus equals A will give Fred AAA. Now the length is 7. So length is not less than 7. So that inner while loop is now complete. We can now move back to the outer while loop. While text length greater than 2, well, since it's now 7 long, it'll go back and try and do the while loop again. But the length is 7, so it's never going to be less than 7 again, so that inner while loop won't get used. We're back to the outer while loop again, and again, and again. That is an indefinite loop. It'll keep going for as long as you let it. It will never see that system.out.println command. It's an infinite loop. So the correct answer is E. The other answers, unfortunately, are wrong. Let's move on to the next topic. Creating and using for loops, including the enhanced for loop. The general format for a for loop is for, open brackets, and then you have initialize, a termination condition, and an increment, or something that happens at the end of the loop in any case. So when it meets that final curly bracket. And then it'll do any tasks in between. So an example might be, for int I equals 0, whilst I is less than 6, I++. And it will keep doing those tasks between the curly brackets as long as I is less than 6. Now what about the enhanced for loop? Here we need a type and then a variable name. Now that type can either be a primitive such as string or integer, or it could be a class name. If it's a primitive, it would be referring to an array. If it was a class name, it'd be referring to a class group. In either case, it would do the things in curly brackets. An example of this would be something like, for student, which is presumably a class, stud, that's the variable, and then class list would be a class group of type student, and it would cycle through that class list looking for each student and display their forename and surname. How about a question? Well, let's try this one. What will be output by the code below? Okay, ready? Let's go through each line. First of all, we're going to set up an array of chars. We're going to call that array name. We're going to initialize the array to 4 items, F, R, E and D. And now we go into the enhanced for loop. We're going to set up a variable called x of type char. And for each char in the array name, it will do something. What it'll do is print name, not x, name. So, since name has 4 items, F, R, E and D, it will print the array name, in other words FRED, 4 times. So the correct answer again is E, Fred, 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 Fred. The other answers, they're wrong. Be careful of questions like this in the exam. They may try and trick you as I did. Now let's move on to the next topic. Create and use do-while loops. The general format of a do-while loop is like this. Do, and then in curly brackets some tasks that need to be performed, while some condition is true. So a specific example might be, do whatever these tasks are, whilst x is greater than 3. Notice that if x starts off as 4, it will still do those tasks at least once. The commands within a do-while loop will be executed at least once. And you can use any sort of logical expression for the condition, so x greater than 12, or use a Boolean variable like not OK. Now I'm sure you're waiting for the question for you. What will be output by the code below? I'll give you a moment to think about it. Okay, let's go through this one command at a time. First of all, we're going to set up a string called txt and populate it with Fred. Now we've got nested do loops. So it'll go into the first do loop, then into the next one, and there it will add an A to the end of Fred. So whilst the text length is less than 2, well, text length is not less than 2, so the inner while loop doesn't get executed again. It only gets executed that once and leaves txt as Fred A. Now we come to the outer while loop. While txt length greater than 7. Well, since the length of txt is 5, it's not greater than 7, so that outer while loop also finishes. So what we end up with is txt being printed out. In other words, the correct answer is B, Fred A. The others, they're wrong. Now, let's move on to the next topic, comparing loop constructs. The commands within the do-while loop will be executed at least once, whilst those in the while loop may not be used at all. The common for loop has a condition of 3 parts: initialize, check, and post operation. The enhanced for loop has only 2 parts: a variable declaration and an array or object list, and it cycles through that array or object list. For loops execute a fixed number of times, whereas while loops depend solely upon their conditions. Now, a question. Which of the following statements is false? I'll give you a moment to think about it. Okay, ready? Well, let's look at part A. A for loop cannot be used inside a while loop. Well, that is false. You can use any kind of loop inside any other kind of loop, and as often as you like. So that one is false. What about B? A while loop cannot be used inside a for loop. Exactly the same logic holds true. You can use any loop inside any other loop. What about C? A for loop cannot be used inside an enhanced for loop. Well, same logic applies, as it does to D, because you can still use any loop inside any other loop. And E, they are all correct except D. Well, that's also false. So we tick that one as well. Be careful of questions like this in the exam. They can get quite tricky. Now, what about the final topic? Break and continue. A break command in any loop or switch construct forces the loop or switch to stop. So that's it over. Whereas the continue command in any loop forces the loop to ignore the remaining commands and go back to the beginning. In other words, it makes the program think it has finished that iteration and makes it go on to the next one. So let's try a little question. What's output by the following code? I'll give you a moment. Okay, let's go through it line by line. We start off by initializing I to 0. Now you may think that the next line would give an error, but I has been declared and it has been initialized, so that first section only has to have the semicolon. Next we check whether I is less than 2. Well, since I is 0, I is less than 2. So we go into the loop. If I is less than 5, well, it is less than 5, continue. So it doesn't see the system.out.print I. It never sees that line at all. Now we meet the closing curly bracket for the for loop. It adds 5 to the value of I, making it 5. We come back to the beginning of the for loop. Is I less than 2? No, I's 5. So the for loop has finished. So now we continue after the final curly bracket, and it just prints out the value of I, 5. 5 is the correct answer. The other ones, unfortunately, don't work so well. So, what do you need to do to study further for exam topic 5? This is just an introduction. To do well in the exam, you will need to study further. Go to the Moodle site for the course and find the links to the Oracle Java tutorial for using loops and constructs. See the list of sections in the Mala Gupta book relevant to using loop constructs. And finally, do post questions and help other students in the Using Loop Constructs forum. And in that way you can get the excellent grades that you deserve.